Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including Maddie Day in conversation with Maria DeRico tomorrow, and Lily King in conversation with Julia Glass on Thursday. You can register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, Welcome to the Future. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them into the Q&A section and we will get to as many questions as we can. We're very excited to welcome Kathryn and Joan. I would like to tell you a little bit about them and then I will turn the event over to them. Kathryn Hulick is a freelance writer, editor, and former Peace Corps volunteer. She writes regularly for Science News for Students and Muse magazine. She has also published numerous nonfiction books on topics such as video games, artificial intelligence, energy technology, and dinosaurs. Kathryn's favorite part of writing about science is getting to speak with researchers in many different fields. Kathryn is working on several novels for kids and published 4 titles as editor of the Beacon Street Girls book series, which I will point out that my daughter loved those books when she was little. She has taught workshops on interviewing techniques and the nonfiction writer for hire market. Kathryn is inspired by authors Roald Dahl, Stephen King, and Ray Bradbury. She loves magical fiction. In addition to writing, she enjoys hiking, gardening, painting, and reading. Kathryn lives in Massachusetts with her husband, son, and dog, Maya. Ammi-Joan Paquette loves caves, hates mushy bananas, and is ambivalent about capybaras. She is the co-author of the 2 Truths and a Lie series and the author of the novels Rules for Ghosting, Paradox, and Nowhere Girl, as well as the picture book Mucky Truck and the Princess Juniper series and many more. Joan is the recipient of a Penn New England Susan P. Bloom Children's Book Discovery Award honor, and her books have been recognized with starred reviews, Junior Library Guild selections, and a wide array of Best of the Year and state reading lists. She lives with her family outside of Boston, where she balances her own writing with her day job as a senior literary agent. And without further ado, I will turn the event over to you, Kathryn and Joan.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. So the first thing I wanted to say before I read a little bit from my book is that I'm so happy to be doing this with Joan because the 2 of us actually met back in 2008 when we both joined the same critique group at the same time. And as the newbies, we kind of bonded over that and we used to meet up on the weekends and write together in a local cafe. So we've known each other for a long time and we've watched each other's careers really blossom over those many years in between, and it's been so much fun. And unfortunately, we haven't seen each other enough lately, but this is a great opportunity for us to, talk to each other again and share our books with you because our books do have some things in common, especially the 2 Truths and a Lie series that Joan's going to talk about today. Because my 2 books that have come out in the last couple of years are both nonfiction for kids in middle school and high school. So I have them both here. So the first one is Strange But True, which is about the science behind paranormal mysteries like ghosts and UFOs and sea monsters and all that cool stuff. And this is really a science book about critical thinking, about how you can understand these types of mysteries using science. And then this book, which comes out today, hooray, after a long wait because of delays and shipping delays. It was supposed to come out in October. But anyway, Welcome to the Future is finally here. And this book is about 10 different technologies that could totally transform the world in the future. And it takes a similar, it looks at science fiction scenarios that you might see in movies or fiction and talks about how could they become real? Could they become real? And do we want them to become real? That's really the heart of this book, is what do we want our future to be? Because all of us have a voice that can be heard when it comes to making those decisions. So I'm going to read the introduction, which is really quick, and then Joan's going to interview me, then she's going to read from one of her books, and I'm going to interview her. So this is the introduction to Welcome to the Future. Here's what it looks like. In the future, will we teleport from place to place, keep dinosaurs as pets, live on Mars, or upload our brains to computers? Will we befriend robots or 3D print our dinners? These are some of the questions we'll explore in this book. Each chapter opens with a vision of a wondrous future that technology might make possible. The challenge for you is to think deeply and carefully. What sort of future do you want for yourself, your family, and your world? Technology advances at breakneck speed all around us as scientists and engineers ponder and imagine, tinker and test, program and debug. They are creating the future. Today, cars drive themselves. People control mechanical arms or legs with their minds. Medical engineers print patches of human skin. Things change fast, but the more you learn about what's possible now, the better prepared you'll be for what's possible next year or 5 years from now. Beyond that, things get murky. Predicting the future is a tricky business. What actually happens is often even stranger than fiction. Back in the 1950s, people imagined robot servants, space settlements, and flying cars, but they didn't imagine that a computer might fit in your pocket or allow you to instantly connect with anyone, anywhere in the world, like we're doing right now. Now we have smartphones, but we can't visit Mars on holiday or ask a robot to make a sandwich. Sometimes a technical barrier holds back a fantastic technology. One reason we don't have robot servants is that mechanical hands can't yet pick up any kind of object. Other times, money is a barrier. Fusion reactors are ridiculously expensive to build and run, so research in this area has moved slowly. The final thing to consider is whether something is right or wrong. This is also called ethics. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. So far, we haven't been willing to risk people's lives to go to Mars, so we've sent robots instead. Similarly, flying cars could easily exist. We have helicopters after all, but flying is trickier than driving, and accidents that happen in the air are much more dangerous. Safety is only one of the reasons we should think twice about doing something. The rich and powerful may use new technology to oppress or control others, and new technology may clash with some people's beliefs or values. The voices of all people matter when it comes to choosing our future. Technology by itself is never simply good or bad. Technology is a tool, and it's how people use that tool that matters. For example, someone could use a 3D printer to make weapons, or they could print homes to replace ones lost in a natural disaster. A mad scientist could someday genetically engineer a monster, but genetic engineering also made it possible to rapidly develop vaccines for COVID-19. We should not fear technology. We should seek to understand it and use it to make the world a better place. Something may seem impossible today, but there's no stopping human imagination, creativity, and willpower. When you know the world you want to live in, you can help create it. Welcome to the future. Thanks.
Awesome. Very exciting. I love all the teasers that kind of come up there. There's a lot of tendrils that speak to the topics that are in the book. All right. So is this the part where I interview you?
Yes.
All right. Well, this is very exciting. So what I want to know first, and I did send you the little list of questions, but then I thought of a different one that's not on the list.
That's
fine. What I want to know, first of all, is what gave you the spark of idea that led you to conceive of this book to begin with?
Well, there are kind of two sparks. One is that I came up with this idea for a book all about artificial intelligence and tried to pitch it and just didn't get any takers. So I had that in the back of my head that I really wanted to write a book about AI. And then I had written Strange But True, and I wanted to write a sequel. So I'm like, I wrote this great book, what could I do as a sequel to this? And I thought, well, what about really crazy technology and whether that could be true? So I really, at first the title was Strange But True 2, 10 technologies, which is a really awkward title. Welcome to the Future is totally better, but
The Revenge.
Yes. for a long time, it was Strange But True 2, 10 technologies that could change the world. So the sequel idea took off, and I figured, well, AI can be one of them. So my AI idea got to kind of sneak in there as one of the chapters, just not a whole book on its own. So that's really the two seeds that led to this book, and it was a lot of fun. It was definitely a lot of fun to work on.
Nice. So how did you decide what topics you were going to cover?
Well,
sure
I did
be a lot of, range.
Yeah, I was trying to think of really kind of outlandish sci-fi scenarios. So really each chapter started from this imagining of what the future could be like. And I went to, I was a avid reader of science fiction, like all through my childhood and still in my adult years. So I had a wealth of scenarios in my head of how the future could be. So I kind of, shuffled among those and picked out the ones that to me felt most cool, like the ones that I thought that kids would really, really love and be inspired by and think were awesome. And then I kind of went back to like, well, where are we now in terms of getting there, and what technology do we have that might make it possible? Is it completely impossible? And one funny thing is that probably my most popular chapter among kids, especially like my son, is the one about dinosaurs and whether we could have a real Jurassic Park. And that idea, to put that in there, didn't occur to me until like the last possible second. Like I had written the whole book. I had one chapter left to write. And I just realized, I'm like, why aren't dinosaurs in this book? Like this.
Every book is better with dinosaurs.
Exactly. I'm like, the idea of having a Jurassic Park, or like being able to create, you know, these living creatures that either never existed or have been extinct for a long time. Here's the picture for that chapter. Nice. I mean, that's just like such an amazing thing that captures all kids' imaginations and adults as well. From the popularity of the Jurassic World series of movies. So yeah, at the last second, I'm like, I'm going to change my last chapter. It was going to be about the Internet of Things. I cut the Internet of Things. I kind of mentioned it in the robot chapter now, but I cut that out and I changed it to dinosaurs. And I'm so glad I did, because it's definitely, a lot of kids turn to that page and are like, what? And they just love it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So you mentioned research. How did you approach these sort of otherworldly, in some cases, topics? Like, what was your writing process, and how did research kind of factor into that?
Yeah, research is huge. I mean, thankfully, I've been a science journalist for over 10 years now. And so I've written about a lot of these topics already. So I had a pretty good background in not all the areas, but in a lot of the areas. So in some cases, I had someone I already knew who I could talk to. But mostly I go to the library and take out a huge stack of books, like 20 at a time, sometimes 10 to 20. I don't read them all, but I flip through them and I get names from those books. I also search online. I look up scientific papers. I'm really looking for research that's happening now. I don't want to know what happened, you know, years ago. I want to know, what are people studying now in these areas? And then I talk to people. I did 55 interviews for this book. Wow. With experts. Yeah. And I am publishing some of those on my website. If you go to kathrynhulick.com, there's a series of, I think I'm up to 11 now. I had aimed for 30. Someday I may get there, but it takes time. I've been trying to post the transcripts, and so people can kind of, because a lot of times I talk to someone for an hour and, you know, one quote would make it into the book, or one tiny paragraph about their work. And that made me feel a little like there's all this stuff that no one's going to see that's really fascinating. So that was the reason I started putting those interviews up there, so people could see kind of into the research process that happens to make a book like this. And then the other thing that happened is the pandemic delayed the book by a year. And during that year, I did a ton of revision because, you know, technology had changed, the world had changed. I kind of had to rethink how I wanted to frame these different technologies. So that was a big task as well. Yeah. Wow. That's awesome. So as you dug into all these like cool topics and did all the research, do you have any sort of anecdote, or what did you find was the most interesting or fun or kind of exciting fact or topic that you discovered? Probably the most fun fact that I discovered is that there actually are scientists out there trying to reverse engineer birds into dinosaurs. They haven't actually made any living creatures. They're doing this work on, like, you know, embryos that wouldn't hatch anyway. So there's no actual living creatures being born, but they're doing this work, you know, genetically, and figuring out how tweaking different genes might make an embryo develop. And they've figured out how to make birds have teeth in their beaks, which because apparently dinosaurs had teeth, and the loss of teeth is, you know, something that has developed over time, and they can kind of take out the genes that made birds lose teeth to have them grow teeth again. So there's stuff like this stuff is actually happening. That to me was just so fascinating. Although I'm sorry to break it to you that the Jurassic Park technique of finding blood in a mosquito and turning that into a dinosaur cannot happen, because they have found blood in mosquitoes, but there's no DNA in it. Interesting. But at least not. Yeah. You think that the whole point of the movie would have sunk in a little bit, but apparently it can't happen that way, but it could happen other ways. Yeah, because DNA only survives for like 1 million years tops, and the last dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. So we're not going to get actual dinosaur DNA, almost definitely not. But there are other ways, like I said, the process I just described of starting with a bird and trying to like reverse engineer the bird back to its dinosaur ancestor could happen. Is this all in your dinosaur chapter? It is, yes. Nice. Yes. Another really cool thing that happened while writing the book actually happened afterwards, is that I interviewed a bunch of fusion energy experts. And one of them, when I was following up to say, hey, this book is coming out, soon, I would love to send you a review copy. He said, hey, we're having a conference in November and we'd love for you to come. So they invited me to their plasma physics conference, which was in Pittsburgh. And I went and I signed books, and they brought in a bunch of middle school kids and donated my book to them. And it was just the coolest thing ever, because I actually got to meet, usually I just do these interviews over Zoom, and I actually got to meet the scientists I'd spoken with, and they did like science demos. And these are the people who are like building the fusion energy reactors that are going to change the world in the future. So I was a total like fangirl,
And I'm sure they were probably like,
yeah.
how many people are, how many, children's book authors are writing about fusion?
Well, there aren't any. That's why,
right?
That's why they were so excited, and they were all excited to get the book for their,
and
for their
kids
families.
love these kind of things, because it's making these, cool, far out, complicated topics really accessible in a way that they can totally get behind.
Right. So that was probably the most fun thing I've ever done as an author, was getting to go to that, physics conference. I tried to attend a few of the sessions, and they were mostly like way over my head, but it was still fun.
But you were in the building.
I was in the building.
It's like the waves are coming at you.
I was where the future was happening. Yes.
Nice. And the future of the next generation too.
Right.
Influencing that. So what else, speaking of the future, do you have coming in the pipeline, either on its way or in the thinking tank?
Yeah, so I can't say too much about it yet, but I'm writing a graphic novel. It's going to be nonfiction, and I'm so excited about it. So that is hopefully going to be a reality in the next couple of years.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Cool. Very cool.
Thanks.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's all my questions.
Okay. Do you want to read your excerpt?
Okay. So back to me taking the stage. Okay. Yes.
Yes.
So, all right. So hello, I'm Joan. And I want to talk about the Two Truths and a Lie. So it's a 3-book series. And it was my first time ever writing nonfiction. These published a few years ago. And the methodology consists of every chapter has 3 stories in it. The stories are all illustrated with photos and maps and art, and all appear to be quite potentially true. They're all kind of out of this world, and they seem far-fetched. 2 of them are true. One of them is made up, as the title, Two Truths and a Lie. So you, as the reader, have to read these stories and determine which one is the fake, ideally by not just straight up Googling it, but like by researching and debating. And a lot of people will do it like as a family over breakfast or in a classroom setting, and sort of going back and forth. And the idea is to sort of get that research skills and critical thinking, and also just have a lot of fun with these kinds of stories. So I'm going to read one of the stories to you today. And this story is, okay, so, and also just loosely topically, this first book, It's Alive, is all the natural world. So people, places, plants. Histories and Mysteries is mostly about the past, and different places and time periods. And then Forces of Nature is science and technology, which is why we're kind of spotlighting this one, because it sort of dovetails with Kathryn's science and technology. So this is ironically not especially technological story that I have, but anyway, it's called Things You Think About When the Sky is Falling, because I like fun titles. Some days are pretty ordinary, ho-hum, just like all the rest. There are a lot of those days, but then there are other days that are less normal. For example, the day enjoyed by an Alabama woman named Ann Hodges. Oh my gosh, I cannot even believe this. On November 30th, 1954. I did not know that was today. Wow, that is amazing. I'm so thrilled with myself for accidentally choosing this story. Just another Tuesday. That's what Anne might have been thinking as she went about her morning. Maybe she cleaned the house a bit, or weeded her garden, or read a book. Sometime after lunch, she lay down for a nap on the couch. The house was quiet, but then suddenly, bam, a horrible crashing sound. She looks up and there's a hole in her ceiling. Her radio appears to have exploded, and ouch, there's an agonizing pain in her hip. What is going on? At first, Anne might have thought there had been some kind of explosion, but then she saw on the floor near her a dark chunk of stone about the size of a loaf of bread. and the hole above it went clear through to the outside. Here's a photo. That's Anne Hodges, and that's the hole in the ceiling. Had this rock smashed through her roof, torn a hole in the living room ceiling, caromed off her radio cabinet, and then crashed into her hip? Yes, yes, and yes. Here's what took this day straight into the history books. Anne Hodges was the first and only human in recorded history to be hit by a meteorite falling from space. An 8.5-pound rock was catapulted down from outer space, way up among the planets and asteroids in our solar system, to dive bomb an unsuspecting lady in her living room. Now let's take a moment to explain some lingo. A meteoroid is a chunk of rock or debris floating in space. When a meteoroid enters Earth's atmosphere, it usually burns up in a flash of light known as a shooting star or meteor. And any plucky pebble that manages to make its way safely through the atmosphere and reach the Earth's surface gets to be called a meteorite. And if it hits a woman named Anne Hodges, it might get an even more specific name, the Hodges meteorite. As you might imagine, outer space is full of rocks and other debris, and a fair bit of this makes it into our atmosphere. The Planetary Science Institute estimates that about 500 meteors hit the Earth's surface every year, but most are tiny. There are exceptions. In 2009, a meteorite smashed through a windshield of an SUV in Ontario, Canada. In 2013, a meteor as big as a 6-story building entered Earth's atmosphere over Russia, exploding into fragments just 15 miles above the surface, creating many smaller meteorites that landed nearby. But these are all the exceptions. 90 to 95% of all meteoroids burn up right on entering Earth's atmosphere. With so few dropping in to say hello, meteorite fragments tend to be very valuable. A nearby farmer found a separate piece of the Hodges meteorite and sold it for enough money to buy a small house and a car. Anne Hodges was not so lucky. She did get a very big bruise on her hip, as you can see there. She was not so lucky. She was renting her house, and while Anne felt that the rock should be hers to keep, she was the one with the bruise after all, her landlady disagreed. Years of legal battles followed, by the end of which there was little profit to be gained. In the end, the Hodges meteorite was donated to the Alabama Museum of Natural History, where it remains to this day. Not the happiest ending for Anne Hodges, alas, but what can you expect from a story that starts with a rude naptime awakening by a drop-in from outer space? Still, it's a good reminder of how much is going on way up there. Space is, you might say, rocking it. Our advice, I know. Keep an eye on the sky. After all, you never know when you're at the start of a day that's going to go down in history. I cannot get over the fact that it was this day in history. That makes my head explode. There you go. So that was one of the stories, and I'm not going to tell you whether it's true or a lie. You may just have to look it up.
So my first question for you is there an answer key in the book, or do people have to use their technology to find the answer?
There is an answer key. Okay. It's funny, when we first wrote it, and I should talk about this next with my co-author and I, Lori Ann Thompson. Yes. We were and I felt very strongly that it should, and both of us did. We were like, this, people can just look up the answer, or then what's the point? Like, it should, but our editors were like, yeah, no, because they should be able to look up the answers. So it's in the back and it's in small print. And the idea is just to have it there, but the fun of it is that research and kind of discovery aspect. Right. Debate.
So what was tricky about writing the lie chapters? Because that's, I write a lot of true chapters, so I know what's tricky about that part. What about writing a chapter that's made up, and what goes into that?
Hard. It was harder than we thought. Now, I came to this as a fiction writer. My co-author Lori came to it as a nonfiction author, and I certainly expected that the fiction would be the easier part, but the thing is that there is so much that already exists. And so, like, in the plants and animals section, what if there was an animal that could do this? Oh, wait, there is. Oh, what if there's an animal that looked like that? Oh, yeah, that exists. So try to come up with something, and then having that line between, you want it to be like kind of believable, but also unbelievable. If it's just like completely out of left field, then it's just going to be ridiculous, but if it's too ordinary, then it's boring. So having that, and trying to, so what I would often do, a lot of the lies came from, some of them were like existing hoaxes that were really perpetuated or really happened, or existing urban legends that we kind of spun off of. Other times, like I combined different things, like, well, this creature exists and this creature exists, but what if you put them together in a symbiotic relationship? Or I always have a hard time talking about the different, like, what is your favorite lie, or what are the, because I have ones that I can say, but I never want to spoil the,
right, you don't want to spoil it.
Once you tell which one's the lie or the truth, it spoils that whole chapter. So there was this one technology that I kept trying. I had written it down as a lie, and every time I would research it, I'm like, oh no, that can be done now, kind of like you said with and then I'm like, okay, let me change it, let me put it in space. Oh wait, no, there's that too. So that was, it was really tricky to kind of, but also fun, because then when you hit on, like, there's a few ones that didn't have any origin in urban legends or existing hoaxes that just ended up coming together, that I feel very proud of, because it was such a like active, sort of creation there.
Yeah, and the hoax thing reminds me a lot of my first book, because I, in the sea monster chapter, I talk about Nessie. And unfortunately, for those of you who don't know, the famous photo of Nessie in Loch Ness was a hoax. It was a head attached onto a toy boat, which the people who made it admitted to later in life. So I was thinking, like, well, you have photographs in the chapter you just read. So how would you have photographs of a lie? But if it's a hoax, you could, because there are,
if it's a hoax,
right.
Well, some of them were manipulated to, or there's photos of certain elements, like of the creature, but not the full creature, or, that kind of thing. There was another one that one of our hoaxes ended up, from the time it got published after it came out, did end up happening. And so we were like, oh shoot,
oh no,
now it's, but so that we're like, okay, well, that one with that human and those details in the way that it happened didn't happen. So, hopefully, but it's funny, things are just always advancing and changing.
Yes,
when you're writing about that kind of future tech, like even within, 5 or 10 years, who knows what your book is going to look like which ones will be already true and which ones will be, kind of like the science fiction of 100 or 50 years ago, where they had all, again, like you were saying, like all this speculative, and, or the movies, now it's both completely unimaginable, but also not nearly as in other ways.
One thing I said in one of my other events is I think there's probably a 99% chance that whatever the predominant technology is, like 50 years from now, it's not in my book. It's funny, probably not even in there at all, just because that's how crazy human innovation is, and like, how hard it is to tell what the future will be. But so you worked with a co-author on this series. You just mentioned her name. I have never done that. So what was that like? And how did you guys find, the process of working together to be, and how did you divide up the work of writing the books?
It was fantastic. It really was. And I think especially in a book like this that was so topically intensive and scattered, like so many different, as you said, like you're doing all this research and like tons of different experts and articles, and then you write a 500-word story and then you move on to the next one. We originally, I think, had sort of approached it in the sense a little bit of, well, I'm the fiction writer and I'm no good at nonfiction. And she's like, well, I don't really write fiction, I write nonfiction. So we were kind of loosely going to be like, well, maybe we'll kind of do it that way. But then as we got started, she was like, I'm kind of digging this whole fiction thing. And I'm like, oh my God, the nonfiction was what got me excited to begin with, the seeing the, part of the original inspiration was just watching these stories, links go by on social media and being like, there's no way, and then you click on it and it's true. So I think we each sort of found something that we were so surprised at really loving, and so what we ended up doing was, again, just finding these links. I would just like, we still have this like spreadsheet with, I would just paste in, and we both would links to the different stories and headlines that caught our eye. And then when it came time to plan out, the hardest part of the entire thing was narrowing it down to 27 topics. In fact, 18, because you could only get, to the 9 chapters, and you only had 2 true stories, and then you had to make up the rest of them, and you're like, oh my gosh, I have like 250 links, like how am I going to narrow it down? And especially because book 1 was like as long as because it's things that are alive. So as long as there was a plant, an animal, or a human in the story, you're all set. And
oh
then
boy.
the history and mysteries, as long as it happened in a place and in a time, you're okay. And then when you finally get down to the end and you only have one book left and you can only pick 18 topics, then it has to be like there's the chapter on physics and the chapter on technology and the chapter on, astronomy, and they're these incredibly specific topics, and it was very stressful. But yeah, so we basically just went, picked our topics, and then we sort of were just like, I called dibs on that one. I was the one who found that one. You can't write that. So we were kind of like, sort of like fighting each other for like our favorite, like, okay, well, I'll give you this one, but I have to write that one because this one, and then, we each wrote our stories, we swapped them, we different times. Like Lori was really good with the photo research, which I would just like, I couldn't even deal with it. And so then I would maybe write more of the intros and some of the quizzes. And, so we just kind of, each read each other's, went back and forth. And it was really helpful to have someone else kind of spotting you and, sort of sharing the process.
And what do you hope readers take away from this series?
I think twofold. I think for one thing, we hope it's just so much fun to read about these wild, unbelievable topics. I think we hope that it brings people together in discussion. I love hearing the stories about families or groups of friends or classrooms that will just each have their champions and just that sort of collaborative aspect. But I think the biggest thing that I hope people will take away from it, and especially young readers, is just the fact that you can't always believe everything, and just because it's in a printed book and there's a photo, or it's on the internet, and and there's we put in each book a discussion guide afterwards, or like a sort of an instructional note at the end, like here's how can you know what's true, here's some tips, guidelines to watch for, and ways to tell, because there's so much misinformation, and it's just so prevalent and it's so believable everywhere you look. So, and I think not all especially young readers are aware of that yet. So just having that sense of critical thinking and judgment of the information that you're taking in, to be like, okay, let me consider the source, let me use my common sense, let me use expert, just like go down the list of how do you know to your best ability if something is true. I think it's such an essential thing in the world today.
Yeah, that's a major theme in my first book. And it's also a theme in my second book as well, is that I'm challenging readers to not just take my word for it, but to think about these things themselves and decide, in my first book, decide whether you think it's real. So very similar to your book. And in my new book, to decide what you want. Like, that don't just believe me that this is the right path forward or that this is the best kind of future. What do you want? Like, what do you think is the right thing? Because I can't tell you that. So it's just really empowering readers to use their minds and not just consume information, but engage with it and question it and ask good questions, deep questions. Yeah. So you write books for all ages and in so many genres. So is there a project that you're really excited about right now, either a new one or another one that's come out recently that you want to share?
Well, I do have, I have two picture books that are on the horizon. One of them just came out this year, Mucky Truck. It's, just about as different as you could possibly get from Two Truths and a Lie. It's a fun, bouncy rhyming picture book about a truck that gets stuck in the mud and has to call his vehicle friends to help out. And then I have another picture book that's publishing in next year in April, and it's called All from a Walnut. And that is a picture book, but also very different. And it's sort of inspired by a, it's inspired by true events. The story itself is not true, but, inspired by my grandfather, who came over from Italy as a little boy to the US. And, it's the story of sort of life and growth and travel, and it's very meaningful to me. And it was illustrated by this wonderful Italian illustrator named Felicita Sala, who, which, since my grandfather's Italian, it has that special connection. So I'm very excited about that.
Yay.
And the art is so wonderful. And I just absolutely can't wait for it. No, March next year, not April.
Oh, yeah. Excellent. Well, those are all the questions I had. we want to take some questions from the chat?
Yes,
this is great. I haven't done a book event in so long. This is fun.
We actually have a few questions.
Okay.
So first one is Suzanne asking Kathryn, what topic do you wish you could have delved deeper into in your book?
Well, I definitely still want to write a whole book about AI, artificial intelligence, because that's been a special love of mine from when I was very young and first learned that it existed. So someday I will write that book. But yes, that is that I had to fit it into one chapter in this book, but I'd love to write more about what's on the horizon with artificial intelligence and how it could work and why we would want it or not want it to whether whether it's going to surpass human intelligence and whether we would want or not want that to happen. Yeah.
Great. Suzanne also asks, what are your tips on having a productive writing session? Any particular things that help you focus or tap into your creative process? And I think you could both answer this.
Yeah. You want to go first, Joan?
Sure. I think, well, first of all, I think everybody has their own, special tricks. So finding what works for you. I work at home, as you can see from the Nessie place, but this is sort of my workspace. So I, when I'm going to write, I go to a coffee shop, as I used to do with Kathryn, or sometimes I have a little desk separately in the room, in the living room. I got a little roll top desk. But really going to a place and sort of being, and maybe it's just like the intentionalness of it and the latte, which I don't really have unless I'm writing. So that, kind of just getting the little rewards and the little motivations, and maybe that the kind of training your brain, oh, this type of caffeine means creativity. And and also maybe just sort of feeling like you don't have to have a huge block of time. That's one thing that can help with it, where sometimes I feel like I used to feel like, okay, it has to be an event, whereas sometimes maybe you'll have a half an hour or an hour, and even just kind of putting yourself in that headspace. And actually, one final tip I just thought of is I read somewhere that if you think, and I've noticed it with myself, like if I'm going to write in the morning, opening up your file the night before and just kind of putting yourself, like just reading through or quickly glancing through it, it kind of puts you in that preparatory zone that can help with focus and sort of distilling that sense of purpose and productivity the next day or later on.
Yeah, I was going to say that's actually one thing I do a lot. I don't do it the night before, but what I do is a lot of times when I have to write something and I'm at that like blank page state of, terror, I will, either read through my research again or write just a couple lines, terrible lines, like a couple like terrible things that are kind of vaguely what I want to say. And then I'll leave. I'll go walk away, take the dog on a walk, go on a run, do something else. And I find that it percolates in my head. And when I come back, I'm ready to write. So I kind of have to just get over that initial,
blank page,
fear of the blank page, just throw something down there and then just let it kind of stew in my head. Or if I ever feel like I'm getting stuck, it's the same thing. Walking away seems to do wonders, just and doing something physical, especially like some sort of getting outside really helps me a lot. And I don't even think about it intentionally. I'll just be wandering around and then, poof, there's a sentence that I want to say. So I do a lot of voice notes when I'm outside walking around of trying to remind myself of the thing I just thought of that I want to write. But yeah, for me, that's a super important part of the process, is just knowing when to kind of take a step back and not actually try to write anything, but let the ideas gel. And the other thing that is, I feel very unproductive when I'm researching, which is ridiculous because that's so important. And a lot of times it's like, I haven't written anything. I haven't written anything today. I haven't written enough. And then I'm actually doing a ton of work when I'm just reading and researching and thinking about it, because then when I sit down to write, often the writing goes so much faster than I ever think it will. Like, I'm like, I have this huge thing to write, and then I do it in like 4 hours because I've done all the work in advance of doing the research and doing the thinking and the coalescing in my head of the ideas that I want to put down. So honestly, even though I feel like I'm not being productive, that time thinking about it and reading about it is super productive.
I like that.
Joan, I think this one was for you. This is from Rosemary, who asked, what age group are these stories geared toward? I have 2 middle school grandchildren.
Yes, it's really approximately like 7 to 14 kind of age, so 8 to 12, 7 to 14, that kind of maybe, I don't know what that is, 4th to 8th grade kind of. Yeah.
My books are geared maybe a little bit older. They're designed for middle grade. So, I mean, I say like 6th grade and up, but if you have a younger child who, you could read it to and explain some of the more tricky concepts or words, you could definitely do that. But reading on their own, I had like a 13-year-old in mind when I wrote them, and I'm thinking probably 6th or 7th grade for reading on their own is a good age for my books. Or older. I think a lot of high schoolers would love my books.
Probably both of you could answer this one too. Alexa says, books about the future seem like such a perfect match for kids. Why do you think there aren't more?
I don't know why there aren't more. I mean, I think that technology and science in general are topics that a lot of people in the children's book world aren't particularly familiar with or comfortable with. A lot of people get into children's books because they love fiction. Like that tends to be a thing that adults have a lot of a bias towards. My friend Melissa Stewart writes a ton about this, about the importance of nonfiction and how much kids love nonfiction, yet the adults in their lives aren't necessarily pushing them towards it or finding things for them that would satisfy that need. So honestly, I started out writing fiction and I fell into nonfiction because I had always loved learning about science, and I got my first article published in a science magazine. And from there, I just kept getting more work. And I was like, whoa, there's a demand for this. I just did the first one because I'm like, oh, this is something I could do to make a little money on the side. And then, the requests kept coming in and I was like, well, there's a real big demand and a real big need. And, I haven't really looked back. I've just been focusing entirely on science writing ever since. And it's been fantastic. And I wish more people were doing it, honestly, because it's so important and kids are so curious and so full of wonder. And it's just amazing to engage with them and introduce them to these topics that they may never have heard of and are going to love.
I think one other reason why there may be a hesitation in writing about the future is just because the future is so changeable. And
yes, that's true.
Again, by the time you finish writing it and it goes to print, is that still going to be, it's very, technology is just moving at such a rapid pace these days. And I think that can be intimidating and challenging and concerning.
Yes. Yeah, that's why one of the things I did is with my scenarios, I made them very, very, very far in the future. So they're pretty outlandish things that, are hopefully not going to be out of
10
date
or 20 years
immediately. Yeah, some of the descriptions of where the technology is now are definitely going to go out of date. Some already are, even though the book just came out today. But the overarching, scenarios and then the thoughts about ethics, those I don't think will go out of date anytime real soon.
Nice.
So I don't see any other questions from our audience. I would like to ask you what you are both reading on your own, or what kinds of books you generally like to read.
Right now, I'm reading The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. It's a nonfiction book about how language works. So I read a lot of nonfiction, mostly nonfiction. I also just finished a fantasy series, the Broken Earth trilogy. So I do enjoy fiction as well. My favorite book I read while researching Welcome to the Future was the book by the woman who came up with the CRISPR technology, Jennifer Doudna. Her book, which I'm blanking on the name of it, but I will look it up quickly. Cracking Creation, that's it. Yeah, that was an amazing book and I recommend it to everybody. It's so, so good. Yeah.
I am, let's see, I'm reading a few books. I just finished this wonderful novel called The House on the Cerulean Sea, which is a fantasy, and it's really cool. I'm also listening to an audiobook. I was just telling you, Stacy, this nonfiction book called Why We Sleep. It's fascinating. It's all about the science of sleep and how much your body needs it. And I I've just been looking at my tiredness in a completely different way instead of being like, oh, no big deal. And I'm like, oh, my body is like really mad at me for only having 6 hours of sleep last night. But it's really fascinating. And I also am reading a middle grade novel called Alone, which is fascinating. And I just started reading it. I'm about halfway through, but it's a novel in verse about this girl who, goes to a sleepover by herself through whatever, and then wakes up and the whole town has been evacuated and she's by herself through some so far unexplained dystopian scenario. It's a quick read and very, very interesting.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any other questions before we say goodnight? Am I missing any? Oh, yes, there is another one here from Diana. If you re-engineer a dinosaur from, let us say, a parrot, would the dinosaur have parrot-like abilities such as IQ and being able to imitate human speech?
Well, I think that really depends on how you do it. And I think this is my Aunt Diana, by the way. I think this is my Aunt Diana, who has a very wonderful pet parrot who I've met before. Oh. But yes, I mean, it really depends on how you do it. I mean, I think that's one of the risks of genetic engineering, is that we don't really know. Like these genes are so interconnected. It's not like one point I make in my chapter is you can't just, I mean, it's not like a word processing program where you can just delete something and paste something in. And these things are all interconnected in ways that are very hard to understand. So if you delete one thing, it could end up messing up something somewhere else that you hadn't even imagined. Like if you try to delete, the bird's feathers to have a featherless bird, you might end up ruining its, the way it, some other totally random thing about its body. Like maybe it can no longer regulate its temperature. I don't know. I'm just making that up off the top of my head. I'm not a biologist and don't know how these things relate, but like these, you end up messing up things that seem totally unrelated. And a lot of times there's many, many, many genes that control one trait. Like the scientist I talked to said tail growth, trying to get a tail to grow on a bird was super tricky. Like there wasn't just one thing that controlled that. There seemed to be many, many things. So it's definitely not an easy science of trying to reverse engineer birds, and not something that's going to happen anytime soon, and maybe never, but it should be possible if we could understand the genetic code well enough. And if we could understand it well enough, then you should be able to control for the things that you want and not have unwanted things sneak in. But again, that's one of the risks, and that's one of the ethical barriers, I think, to maybe not doing this. Yeah.
We do have one more from Alyssa, who asks, have either of you enjoy reading poetry? And if so, do you have any recommendations?
Yes. Whether I can think of a recommendation. I've been reading some really great poetry. I've been reading Ada Limon, and I can't think of any book off the top of my head. And who else? I have to think about it.
Yeah, I don't read a lot of poetry, but I should. I love it when I do read it. So I don't really have any recommendations either, but it is something I wish I read more of. So people can send me recommendations and I'll look them up.
Rosemary said she enjoyed listening to you both very much and will be looking forward to reading your work with great interest. And that seems like a good place to say thank you both so much for joining us tonight and for your interesting conversation, and to everybody who came, or
it's been wonderful
whatever you call it when we're online. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a great night.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming.
Nice to be here with you. Have a good evening.
You too.